She stood alone in the snow. Her small hands were shaking. But she didn't cry. Not anymore. Inside the hospital, her mother was dying. Just 2 days ago, it was her brother. 3 days before that, her father. Now, she was the only one left. She watched the window, but no one waved back. No doctors came out. No nurse even looked at her. She wasn't allowed inside. They said it was dangerous. They said the sickness was spreading fast. But no one told her why everyone was coughing blood. Why people died within hours. Why the streets were so quiet, except for the sound of horses pulling carts filled with bodies. She was only 10, but in just 1 week, she had aged a lifetime. It wasn't war. Not the kind with guns and bombs. But it felt worse. Because the enemy was invisible. They called it the Spanish flu. Though it didn't come from Spain. They didn't know where it came from. No one really knew how to stop it. Doctors wore strange masks. Schools shut down. Church bells stopped ringing. Even the graveyards were full. She remembered her father's last words. "Stay strong, Maria. You are brave." But brave didn't stop the fever. Brave didn't stop the bleeding. Brave didn't stop the dying. For months, she stood outside hospitals. Sometimes with food. Sometimes with hope. But mostly with silence. She hadn't spoken in days. Her voice, like her childhood, had vanished. The year was 1918. The world had just ended a war. But now, something worse had begun. A pandemic was sweeping across every country, every village, every home. It would kill more people than the war ever did. It would leave millions of children like Maria, alone, cold, and waiting. But no one knew that yet. All they knew was that the coughing had just begun. It started quietly, not with explosions, not with fire or tanks, but with a soldier coughing in a camp in Kansas, USA. Spring, 1918. America had joined World War I. Soldiers trained hard. They shared tents, food, and stories. And unknowingly, a deadly virus. At first, no one thought it was serious. Just the flu, they said. Common. Annoying. Some men stayed in bed. Most got better. But then something changed. The sickness got faster, stronger, and stranger. Young, healthy soldiers were gasping for air. Their faces turned dark blue. Some died within 24 hours. Doctors were confused. They had no name for it. No cure. No answers. They tried to keep it quiet. After all, the world was at war. Morale was important. Panic was dangerous. So, the news was hidden. No headlines. No warnings. No one was told what was coming. But the virus didn't wait. It traveled with the soldiers. From Kansas to New York. From ships to the trenches of Europe. From camp to camp. From man to man. The world was already bleeding from the war. Now it would bleed from within. In crowded barracks and on muddy battlefields, the flu spread like wildfire. 1 soldier sneezed. 10 caught it. 3 died. By summer, the virus had reached France. Then Germany. Then Italy. It rode trains. It crossed oceans. No borders could stop it. No army could fight it. Hospitals filled too quickly. Doctors fell sick. Nurses collapsed. And still, no one could explain it. It wasn't just a fever. It was a storm inside the body. People shook with chills. Their skin turned pale. Their lungs filled with fluid. Some bled from their noses, eyes, and ears. One nurse wrote in her diary, "We had to turn the dying on their sides, so they wouldn't drown in their own lungs." Cities were next. Crowded, dirty, and unprepared. Philadelphia held a parade. Thousands danced in the streets. 3 days later, hundreds were dead. Within a week, they were digging mass graves. Still, many didn't believe it, or didn't want to. They kept schools open. They went to theaters. They hugged. They sneezed. They spread. It wasn't just one wave. It came in 3. The first was strange. The second was deadly. The third destroyed what was left. By autumn, bodies were stacked like firewood. Churches turned into morgues. Families dug graves in their yards. In some places, even undertakers died. There was no one left to bury the dead. And yet, the world kept quiet. Because newspapers didn't want fear. Because governments didn't want riots. Because the war needed to look like it was being won. Only Spain reported the truth. Because they weren't in the war. So people called it the Spanish flu. But it wasn't Spanish. And it wasn't just the flu. It was something much worse. Children like Maria were left alone. Wives lost husbands. Entire families vanished in days. It attacked the strongest first. Not the very old. Not the very young. But the ones in their prime, 20s and 30s. Some scientists believe the immune system overreacted. It caused the body to destroy itself. The very thing meant to protect us became the weapon. And still, there was no cure, no vaccine, no explanation, just silence, and coughing, and death. By the time autumn came, the virus had no name. Doctors didn't know what it really was. They called it influenza, but it wasn't like any flu they'd ever seen. It moved faster, it hit harder, and it killed without mercy. Still, no one in power dared to speak the truth. Why? Because the world was still at war. In 1918, information was controlled. Governments wanted soldiers to stay brave. They wanted people to keep fighting, and they didn't want to look weak in front of enemies. So, they said nothing. Even as hospitals overflowed, even as cemeteries ran out of space, even as doctors collapsed from exhaustion. In America, the press stayed quiet. In Britain, warnings were buried. In Germany, the news was twisted. No one wanted the enemy to know their country was falling apart from inside. Not from bombs, but from breath. But in Spain, things were different. Spain was neutral. They weren't in the war. So their newspapers were free. They printed the truth. Stories of mass illness, photos of dying families, reports of empty towns. And so, the world gave the virus a name, the Spanish flu. It wasn't fair. Spain didn't start it, but they told the truth. And for that, they were blamed. Meanwhile, the real origin? Still a mystery. Some say it began in a Kansas military camp. Others point to a village in France, or a hospital in China. No one knows for sure, but it didn't matter, because the damage had begun. In just a few weeks, the flu had circled the globe. Africa, India, Brazil, Russia. No country was safe, no family untouched. But the silence continued. World leaders told people to stay calm, to go to work, to keep factories running, to support the war, even as entire neighborhoods were coughing blood, even as funeral carts rolled by every morning. It was as if the world had chosen blindness, as if the truth itself had fallen sick. Doctors wore masks made of gauze. Some soaked them in chemicals. None of it helped. People carried onions in their pockets, burned herbs in their homes. Some wore garlic necklaces. Desperate, helpless. In parts of India, the flu killed so fast that trains arrived with dozens of dead passengers. Families left bodies at train stations. There were too many to bury. In Iran, towns lost half their population. In South Africa, mass graves were dug with bulldozers. Yet still, the war took center stage. Newspapers wrote about victories, not funerals. Radio broadcasts spoke of peace treaties, not overflowing hospitals. It was as if the world couldn't face two tragedies at once. So it chose to hide one. But the virus didn't care about headlines. It kept spreading. It kept killing. It went into homes and churches. It rode streetcars and horses. It touched hands, food, and air. It infected kings and beggars, soldiers and farmers, priests and children. In cities like New York, sirens rang all night. Ambulances couldn't keep up. Doctors worked until they dropped. There weren't enough coffins. People buried their loved ones in bed sheets. And yet, people still asked, "What is this? Where did it come from?" No one could answer. It was a mystery, a killer with no face, no warning, no mercy, and worst of all, no name that made sense. The Spanish flu was not Spanish. It was everywhere. It was everyone's. But with no real science, no proper knowledge, and no global voice to warn the people, it continued, unseen, untouched, unstoppable. And the second wave was still to come. Summer faded. Autumn arrived. But the sickness, it didn't leave. In fact, it returned. Stronger, faster, deadlier. What the world thought was the end was only the beginning. This second wave would be unlike anything doctors had ever seen. It came without mercy, and it didn't wait. In some places, people woke up healthy. By nightfall, they were dead. This time, the virus didn't just attack the weak. It attacked the strong. Men and women in their 20s and 30s, the healthy, the fit, the ones who were supposed to survive. But they didn't. Many collapsed in the streets. They turned blue within hours. Their lungs filled with fluid. They drowned from inside. It wasn't just a cough anymore. It was a storm inside the body. In Philadelphia, it started with one funeral. Just one. The city had just held a parade, a big one. Over 200,000 people came, dancing, cheering, laughing. 3 days later, hospitals were full. 6 days later, people were dying in their homes. 1 week later, Bodies were piling in the streets. The city begged for help, but there were no doctors left to send. Most were sick themselves. One local official said, "We need 500 gravediggers. We have 50. Priests gave blessings through windows. Children were left to bury their parents. Sometimes, neighbors wouldn't even open their doors. Fear was stronger than friendship, than kindness, than anything. In New York, families nailed bed sheets to their doors. A signal, we're sick. Don't come in. In Chicago, nurses went house to house. But even they began to fall. In some towns, there were no living adults left. Only orphans. Silent. Hungry. Watching. The second wave didn't just kill, it destroyed hope. Hospitals ran out of beds. Out of space. Out of doctors. Even out of coffins. In parts of India, there weren't enough flames for cremation. Bodies were left on riverbanks. Birds circled above. The air smelled of death. In Brazil, whole villages disappeared. No one came to help. In Alaska, some Inuit communities lost every single person. Entire cultures erased in silence. And yet, the world barely remembers this wave. Why? Because it came during war, and it passed like a nightmare. No time to mourn. No room to reflect. By November 1918, people celebrated the end of World War I. They danced in the streets, kissed strangers, held parades again. And the virus? It was still there, waiting. The third wave began as peace celebrations spread. It was quieter than the second, but no less cruel. The sick returned to crowded trains, to big cities, to family gatherings. And once again, the flu spread. People were too tired to fight, too numb to care, too broken to believe. By early 1919, it was still killing, still filling graveyards, still silencing laughter. But slowly it faded. Not because of a cure, not because of science, but because it had already taken what it wanted. The virus ran out of fuel. It had burned through cities, ships, and souls. And when it had taken enough, it left. Not with a warning, not with a goodbye, just silence and grief. In the end, over 50 million people were dead. Some say 100 million. No one truly knows. Because many deaths weren't counted. Because many were buried without names. Because some countries never spoke of it again. The Spanish flu killed more people than World War I. It changed the world. But the world tried to forget it. No grand memorials. No museums. No national days of mourning. Just dust. And silence. But survivors remembered. They always remembered. They remembered the coughing. The fear. The empty chairs at the dinner table. The numbers were huge. 50 million dead. Maybe more. But behind each number was a name. A face. A family. The Spanish flu didn't care about who you were. It didn't care about borders, flags, or language. It came for everyone. In India, a young mother named Asha tried to keep her children alive. She lived in a small village near the Ganges River. When the fever came, she gave up her own food to feed her children. She watched her husband die in front of her, then her youngest child. Still, she stayed strong. But when her body began to shake, she knew it was over. There were no doctors in the village. No medicine. No help. Before she closed her eyes for the last time, she whispered, "Don't forget us." But the world did. In Kansas, a nurse named Clara worked 18 hours a day. She was only 19, fresh out of nursing school. She cleaned the floors, wiped blood from mouths, held dying hands that had no family left. She wrote letters for the sick, whispered prayers into ears that would never hear them again. One day, she felt dizzy. Her skin was hot. She knew what it meant. Still, she worked that day. And the next, she died in her uniform. No funeral, no goodbyes. Just another empty hospital bed, quickly filled by another patient. In West Africa, a young boy named Kofi saw his village change overnight. His teacher stopped coming to school. The store closed. People stopped talking. Then, they stopped breathing. Kofi didn't understand the words pandemic or virus, but he understood hunger. He understood death. He watched as his grandmother was wrapped in a white sheet and taken away. He never saw her again. He survived, but he never smiled the same. In London, a poet named Thomas lost his wife and daughter in the same week. He burned every page he had ever written. He said words meant nothing if they couldn't bring them back. For the rest of his life, he wrote nothing but one sentence in his diary. "They left me in silence." All across the world, millions lived with that silence. The silence of empty homes, of dinner tables with missing chairs, of streets once loud, now quiet. The silence of grief. In Chile, Japan, Nigeria, Russia, Australia, the stories were the same. A child clinging to a parent. A man digging graves for strangers. A woman walking for miles with her sick baby in her arms, hoping, just hoping, for help. And for many, help never came. We often remember the wars, the battles, the heroes with medals. But who remembers Clara, or Asha, or Kofi, or Thomas? The ones who didn't fight with guns, but with faith, with hope, with bare hands and broken hearts. They are the forgotten ones. Their names never made headlines. Their photos were never shown. Their stories buried with them. But without them, the world wouldn't have survived. The Spanish flu was not just a medical disaster. It was a human one. It took love. It took laughter. It took futures. But it also showed something else, something powerful. Even in the worst times, people cared. People helped. People held each other up, even as they fell. That is what stayed behind. Not just the death, but the courage, the quiet acts of kindness. The people who gave everything, so someone else might live. In 1918, science was blind. Doctors had no microscope strong enough to see a virus. They didn't know what they were fighting. They thought the flu was caused by bacteria, not a virus. So they treated the wrong thing. They used the wrong tools. They were guessing while people died. There were no antibiotics, no antivirals, no ventilators, no vaccines, just hope and trial and error. They tried bleeding patients to release the sickness. Some made teas from onions, garlic, or vinegar. Others burned sulfur in homes. None of it worked. Hospitals ran out of beds. So churches became wards. Schools became clinics. Prisons became hospitals. Doctors wore masks made from gauze and cloth. Some soaked them in chemicals. But the virus was too small. It slipped through. They told people to avoid crowds, to stay indoors. But they didn't know how long, or how far it could spread. Cities passed new laws. Spitting in public became illegal. Theaters closed. Schools shut down. But not everyone listened. Some thought it was just a cold. Some thought it was a lie. In San Francisco, people protested mask mandates. They said it was against their freedom, even though people were dying in the streets. Confusion spread faster than the virus. Fear filled the space where facts should have been. Doctors worked until their hands bled. Nurses collapsed in hallways. Some hospitals lost half their staff to the illness. Others had no one left to care for the sick. Still, they didn't give up. Some scientists tried to make vaccines. They used bits of dead bacteria, hoping it might help. But it didn't. It would be years later, decades, even, before the truth came out. The Spanish flu was caused by the H1N1 virus. A tiny, invisible killer. Passed through breath, touch, air. It didn't care about race or country, only lungs. And the worst part? Most of the damage wasn't caused by the virus itself, but by the body's own defense. Young adults died more because their immune systems overreacted. They created a cytokine storm. The body attacked itself. Healthy lungs filled with liquid and drowned. The stronger the body, the faster the fall. Science didn't know that in 1918. All they saw were people dying, faster than they could be counted. There were no answers, only guesses. And in the shadows of that silence, millions died. Some doctors wrote everything down. They drew pictures, wrote diaries, tried to understand. They hoped the future would learn from them. But after the flu ended, many of their notes were ignored, or lost, or forgotten. The world wanted to move on, not look back. And so science stayed in the shadows. Until it happened again. By mid-1919, the coughing slowed. The fever passed. The dead stopped rising in number. People stepped out of their homes. They walked through streets filled with silence. Shops reopened. Church bells rang again. Birds sang in the trees. But the world didn't celebrate. There were no parades, no speeches, no moment of silence. The Spanish flu was over. But something inside people had changed. They had survived a war and a plague, but they were not the same. In homes across the world, chairs sat empty. Fathers were gone. Mothers were buried. Children alone. There was food again, but no appetite. There was music, but no dancing. Some couldn't speak of it. The pain was too fresh. Others couldn't stop speaking. The fear lived in their lungs. Survivors had nightmares, sleepless nights, grief that never healed. Some developed lifelong lung problems. Some lost their memory. Some lost faith. And yet, life went on. People married, built homes, had children, worked farms, started over. But the flu? It faded from history. Textbooks rarely mentioned it. There were no memorials in cities, no statues, no remembrance days. Why? Because the world was tired. Because death had come too fast, too suddenly, too painfully. And maybe because it was no one's fault. There were no enemies to blame, no villains, only a tiny virus, unseen, unheard. So people buried the past, like they buried the bodies, quietly, quickly, deep underground. But some remembered. An old man in Argentina still cleaned his wife's grave every Sunday. A schoolteacher in Australia still lit a candle each September. A nurse in Canada wrote her story, page by page, until her final breath. They remembered the ones who were lost, the ones who coughed through the night, the ones who died alone. They remembered how people helped. Strangers bringing food, doctors working without rest, children singing outside windows. They remembered the kindness, the courage, the silence. And now, over 100 years later, the world remembers again. When a new virus came in the 21st century, people looked back. They found the old photos, the forgotten journals, the headlines from 1918, and they realized, we've been here before. The masks, the fear, the silence, the waiting. It happened once, and it happened again. But this time, science had a voice. Doctors had better tools. The world was more connected. Still, the pain felt familiar. And so did the lessons. That life is fragile. That truth must be told. That silence can kill more than sound. That we are not alone, not in suffering, not in hope. She's old now, eyes dimmed by time, hands wrinkled, bones soft. But when she closes her eyes, she still hears the silence of 1918. She remembers the white dress, the flowers she held for her mother, the way the door never opened again. Her name is Eleanor. She's 108 years old, and she is one of the last to remember. She sits in a wheelchair by the window. The sunlight warms her face. A nurse feeds the birds outside, and on her lap, a photo album, pages frayed with age. She turns them slowly. Black and white photos, names written in cursive, some crossed out. Her father, her older brother, her teacher, gone. And yet she smiles, because she remembers not only the loss, but the love. The neighbor who left soup at their door, the priest who sang through the window, the girl next door who whispered bedtime stories from her balcony. I was just a child, she says softly, but I remember everything. Every year, on the same day, she writes a letter. To no one in particular. To the sky. To the lost. She writes, "You were not forgotten. I carry you in every breath. You taught me to be kind, to listen more, to waste nothing, and to love deeply. When the world slept, you reminded me to wake up." She seals the letter and hands it to the wind. The nurse watches her, eyes moist, heart full. "You're a miracle," she whispers. But Eleanor shakes her head. "No, I'm just a memory that lived long enough to speak." Outside, children run in the yard. Laughter floats like dandelion seeds, their joy untouched by the pain of the past. And that's how it should be. Not to erase history, but to honor it with life. Eleanor watches them run, and as a young boy falls and cries, another helps him up. No hesitation, no fear, just kindness. And in that moment, Eleanor smiles. Because the world, her world, is healing. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. In the silence of loss, in the hush of hospital halls, in the quiet courage of those who kept going. The Spanish flu came like a thief, took millions without mercy. But from the ashes rose new voices, new lives, new hope. We remember not just to mourn, but to learn. And above all, to never sleep through compassion again. If this story touched your heart, if you believe the past holds lessons we must never forget, then please subscribe to our channel. We bring you true stories, mysterious, heartbreaking, and powerful, from the forgotten corners of history. One story at a time, we remember the voices that time tried to silence.